Part 1, First Contact. The crystalline spires of the Terran Diplomatic Center caught the setting sun's rays, casting prismatic patterns across Ambassador Nyara's violet skin. She adjusted her formal robes, the iridescent fabric shifting colors with each movement, a traditional gesture of openness among her people, the Lysirians. The human guards watched her with poorly concealed fascination as she glided past their checkpoints. Nyara was used to such attention. Lysirians were still a rare sight on Earth, even 5 years after first contact. Their bioluminescent skin and ethereal appearance tended to draw stares. Ambassador Nyara, a deep voice, called out. She turned to face Commander James Barrett, the newly appointed head of Terran-Lysirian relations. His broad shoulders filled out his formal military uniform impressively, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. They held none of the usual wariness humans displayed toward her kind. "Commander Barrett," she replied, inclining her head in the traditional Lysirian greeting. "I trust the preliminary talks went well?" "As well as can be expected when discussing the future of two species," he said with a wry smile. "Though I must admit, some of my colleagues are still adjusting to interspecial diplomacy." Nyara's bioluminescent patterns shifted slightly, betraying her amusement. "You mean they're uncomfortable with the fact that we can sense their emotional states through their biochemical signatures?" Barrett laughed, a sound that sent an unexpected warmth through her core. "That would be putting it mildly. Admiral Richardson nearly had a conniption when your delegate pointed out his anxiety during the trade negotiations." They walked together toward the main conference chamber, their steps falling into natural synchronization. Nyara found herself studying Barrett's profile, noting how different he was from the other military personnel she'd encountered. Where they were stiff and formal, he moved with an easy confidence. Where they spoke in careful diplomatic platitudes, he offered genuine conversation. "I've read your proposals for the Joint Defense Initiative," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "They're surprisingly progressive." Barrett's stride hitched slightly. "You mean I'm not advocating for keeping our species segregated like most of the old guard?" His tone was light, but Nyara could sense the underlying tension in his biochemical signature. "Precisely. You actually seem to believe in true cooperation, not just peaceful coexistence." They reached the conference chamber doors, but Barrett paused before entering. "Ambassador, my father served during first contact. He was there when our species nearly went to war over a simple misunderstanding of cultural norms. I watched him work himself to death trying to prevent future conflicts through isolation and separation." His eyes met hers with startling intensity. "I learned from his mistakes. The universe is too vast and too dangerous for any species to face it alone." Nyara's natural glow brightened slightly at his words, her species' involuntary response to strong emotion. "A remarkably enlightened view, Commander." "James," he corrected softly. "At least in private. All this formal titling gets exhausting." "James," she tested the name, noting how his pupils dilated slightly at her use of it. "Then you must call me Nyara." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Nyara couldn't quite identify. Then the chamber doors slid open, revealing Admiral Richardson's stern face. "Commander Barrett, Ambassador," he said sharply. "The Council is waiting." As they entered the chamber, Nyara caught a glimpse of something on Richardson's desk that made her blood run cold, a document bearing the classified markings of her homeworld's military command. A document that shouldn't have been possible for humans to possess. She glanced at James, who was already engaged in conversation with other officials, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Whatever conspiracy was unfolding here, she would need an ally she could trust. And somehow, despite everything she'd been taught about maintaining professional distance from humans, she knew James Barrett was that ally. The council session began, but Nyara's mind was already racing ahead, planning how to approach James with her discovery. She'd been sent to Earth to strengthen diplomatic ties between their species. Instead, she might have stumbled upon something that could tear those ties apart forever. As if sensing her distress, James caught her eye across the chamber and raised an eyebrow in silent question. Nyara gave him a subtle gesture that she hoped conveyed, "We need to talk." His slight nod told her he understood. The game was about to begin, and the stakes were higher than either of them yet realized. Part 2, Breaking Protocol. The gardens atop the Terran Diplomatic Center were designed to accommodate both human and alien dignitaries, featuring an eclectic mix of Earth flora and carefully cultivated extraterrestrial specimens. Nyara paced between luminescent Laserian night blooms and terrestrial rose bushes, her skin shifting through shades of violet as she waited. James Barrett appeared exactly at the arranged time, still in his formal uniform but with the collar loosened, a small breach of protocol that somehow made him seem more trustworthy. "Your message seemed urgent," he said without preamble, joining her beside a softly glowing fountain. "And based on your current chromatic fluctuations, I'd say I'm right." Nyara's eyes widened slightly. "You've studied Laserian physiological responses?" "I make it a point to understand those I work with," he replied with a slight smile. "Including the fact that rapid violet to indigo shifts usually indicate severe distress." She took a deep breath, her glow stabilizing. "What I'm about to tell you violates at least 6 diplomatic protocols and could be considered treason by both our governments." James's expression turned serious, but he didn't back away. Instead, he moved closer, using his body to shield their conversation from any potential observers. "Go on." "The document I saw on Richardson's desk, it was a Laserian military deployment schedule. Top secret, quantum encrypted. It should have been impossible for humans to access it." She watched his face carefully as she continued. "But that's not the worst part. The dates and coordinates don't match any official movements I'm aware of." "You think someone's running unauthorized operations?" James's voice dropped even lower. "I think someone's orchestrating a conflict." Nyara's luminescence darkened with worry. "Those coordinates, they're all along disputed territories. One wrong move, one accidental engagement, could restart the tensions from first contact," James finished, his jaw tightening. "But this time with both sides armed and ready for war." "Exactly. But I can't prove anything without accessing Richardson's private files, and I can't do that without human help," James concluded. He ran a hand through his short dark hair, a gesture Nyara was beginning to recognize as his way of processing difficult decisions. "You realize what you're asking? If you're wrong about this." "I'm not wrong." Nyara moved closer, close enough that her bioluminescence cast soft patterns across his face. "James, my people have a saying, truth glows in the darkness. We can literally sense deception in others. When Richardson spoke about strengthening ties between our species today, his biochemical signature was, wrong. Artificially controlled." James studied her for a long moment, and Nyara felt her heart's beat faster under his scrutiny. Finally, he spoke. "My access codes won't get us into his private files. But I know someone who might be able to help. The question is, do you trust me enough to go off the grid? Because once we start this, there's no going back." Nyara thought about her position, her duties, everything she'd worked for. Then she thought about the devastation another human Laserian conflict would cause. "I trust you," she said simply. His hand found hers in the darkness, warm and solid. "Then we need to move fast. Richardson's hosting a diplomatic dinner in an hour. It's our best chance to access his office, but we'll need a distraction." A slow smile spread across Nyara's face, making her glow brighten. "As it happens, Laserian diplomats are known for causing scenes when our cultural sensitivities are offended. And humans do make so many cultural faux pas." James's answering grin held a mixture of admiration and mischief. "I'm starting to think I underestimated you, Ambassador." "Nyara," she corrected softly. If we're about to become fugitives together, we might as well use first names. The dinner began precisely as planned. Nyara made her entrance in traditional Lazirian formal wear, the living fabric responding to her emotional state with subtle color shifts. She noted Richardson watching her with barely concealed disdain, his carefully controlled biochemical signature setting off warning signals in her sensory organs. 20 minutes into the first course, she stood abruptly, her skin flashing with apparent outrage. "Admiral Richardson," she proclaimed loudly, "surely you cannot be serious about serving fermented animal products at a diplomatic function." The room fell silent as every eye turned to them. Richardson's face reddened. "I assure you, Ambassador, our chefs are well versed in alien dietary requirements. This is beyond dietary concerns." Nyara's voice rose dramatically, her skin now pulsing with bright patterns of distress that made several humans shield their eyes. "In my culture, the presentation of aged dairy products suggests a desire for violent conflict. Are you deliberately provoking an interspecial incident?" As the room erupted into chaos, with diplomats from both species trying to mediate, Nyara caught James's subtle nod as he slipped away. She maintained her performance, drawing all attention as he made his way to Richardson's office. 10 minutes later, her communicator vibrated with a prearranged signal. James had what they needed. Nyara allowed herself to be calmed down by the other diplomats, accepting Richardson's stiff apology with grave dignity. She met James in the garden again, her hearts racing with more than just the excitement of their successful ruse. "Did you find anything?" His expression was grim as he held up a data crystal. "More than we bargained for. Richardson isn't working alone, this goes all the way up to the Terran Security Council. And they have contacts in your government too." Before Nyara could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the building. James grabbed her hand. "They must have detected the data breach. We need to go. Now." "Where?" "I have a safe house off the grid. But we'll have to trust each other completely from here on out." He squeezed her hand. "Are you ready for that?" Nyara's answer was cut off by the sound of security forces approaching. Without further discussion, they ran together into the darkness, leaving behind the carefully ordered world of diplomacy for an uncertain future where the only thing they could count on was each other. As they disappeared into the night, Nyara realized that she'd never felt more alive, or more terrified, in her life. But with James's hand firmly clasping hers, she knew she'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Part 3, The Chase Begins. James's safe house turned out to be an abandoned atmospheric processing facility on the outskirts of New Shanghai. The massive machinery provided excellent cover from thermal scanning, while the residual electromagnetic interference helped mask their presence from more conventional detection methods. "The interference should help hide your bioluminescence too," James explained as he secured the entrance. "Though I have to admit, it's fascinating watching your colors shift." Nyara felt her skin warm to a deeper purple at his observation. "Most humans find our chromatic responses unsettling." "Most humans are idiots," he replied matter-of-factly, setting up portable scanning equipment. "Now, let's see what was worth triggering every security system in the diplomatic quarter." They huddled together over the data crystal, their shoulders touching as James projected its contents. Complex tactical data filled the air around them, showing troop movements, weapons deployments, and communication patterns. By the first light, Nyara breathed, her luminescence dimming with horror. "They're not just trying to start a war, they're orchestrating a full-scale invasion." James's jaw tightened as he studied the projections. Both sides think they're responding to aggression from the other. Richardson and his conspirators have been feeding false intelligence to both human and Lazirian military commands for months. But why? What could they possibly gain from Nyara stopped, her sensory organs detecting a sudden shift in the air. "James, someone's here." He moved instantly, killing the projection and drawing his weapon. "How many?" At least 6, no, 8. Their biochemical signatures are masked, but I can still sense their movement patterns. She closed her eyes, concentrating. They're trying to surround us. Special forces, James muttered. They're not taking any chances. He grabbed their essential gear with one hand while taking her arm with the other. There's a maintenance shaft that leads to the underground transport tubes. If we can reach it. The first explosion rocked the facility, sending them stumbling together. Nyara's natural grace helped her keep her balance, and she found herself supporting James's weight as debris rained around them. This way, she shouted, her enhanced vision cutting through the smoke. They ran together through the darkened facility, their footsteps echoing off metal walkways. Energy weapons fire erupted behind them, filling the air with the scent of ozone. Down! James tackled her as a bolt of plasma seared through the space where she'd been standing. They rolled together behind a massive coolant tank, their bodies pressed close in the confined space. You're bleeding, Nyara noticed, touching his shoulder where a piece of shrapnel had caught him. It's nothing, he started to say, but stopped when her hand began to glow with a soft blue light. The pain in his shoulder eased as her natural healing enzymes seeped into the wound. You never mentioned Lycerians could do that, he said softly, his eyes locked on hers. It's intimate, she admitted. Usually reserved for family members. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities, until another explosion reminded them of their situation. The transport tube access is 30 meters ahead, James said, checking his weapon. But they'll be expecting that. Nyara's skin rippled with patterns of determination. Then let's give them something unexpected. She reached into her robes and withdrew a small crystal. This is supposed to be used for diplomatic emergencies only. It'll temporarily overload any nearby neural implants. James's eyes widened. That'll affect most of our pursuers, but what about your own cybernetic enhancements? I'll manage, she said grimly. Just be ready to carry me if I lose consciousness. Before he could protest, she crushed the crystal in her hand. A high-pitched whine filled the air, followed by the sounds of several bodies hitting the floor. Nyara swayed, her luminescence flickering erratically, but James was already there, supporting her weight as they ran. They reached the transport tube access just as a second wave of pursuers appeared. James fired several precise shots, forcing them to take cover, while Nyara worked to override the tube's security protocols. Almost there. She muttered, her fingers dancing over the controls even as her vision blurred from the crystal's aftereffects. The access hatch slid open with a hiss of hydraulics. Ladies first, James said with a grin that somehow managed to be both professional and roguish. They dropped into the tube just as reinforcements arrived. The magnetic propulsion system engaged, hurling them through the underground network at near supersonic speeds. Nyara found herself clinging to James, their bodies pressed together in the confined space as they fled through the darkness. We need to warn both governments, she said once they'd put some distance between themselves and their pursuers. But Richardson's people will have locked us out of all official channels. Then we'll need to do this the hard way, James replied, his arms still secure around her waist. I have a contact, someone who operates outside official channels. But reaching her will mean going into the heart of the city's criminal underground. Nyara's skin pulsed with determination. Whatever it takes. We didn't come this far to fail now. The transport tube shot them toward the sprawling undercity of New Shanghai, where neon lights masked endless shadows and allegiances changed as quickly as credits changed hands. As they traveled, Nyara became increasingly aware of James's proximity, of the way his heart rate elevated slightly whenever she moved against him. James, she said softly, what you said earlier, about most humans being idiots, why are you different? Why do you seem so comfortable with me? He was quiet for a long moment, and she worried she'd overstepped. Finally, he spoke. My mother died during first contact. Not in the fighting, but trying to prevent it. She was a xenobiologist, one of the first to recognize Lycerians as truly sentient. She believed our species were meant to help each other grow, not fear each other's differences. His arms tightened around her slightly. I grew up with her research, her dreams. When I look at you, I don't see an alien. I see. The transport tube suddenly screeched to a halt, throwing them against each other as emergency brakes engaged. They found us, Nyara said, her sensory organs already detecting pursuit signals. Then let's give them a proper welcome, James replied, helping her to her feet. Ready to see how the other half of New Shanghai lives? Nyara's skin brightened with anticipation. Lead the way, Commander. Together, they forced open the tube's emergency exit, emerging into the neon-drenched chaos of the Undercity. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners, and perhaps, Nyara thought as James's hand found hers in the darkness, as something more. Part 4, Bonds Forged in Fire. The Undercity of New Shanghai pulsed with a life of its own, a twisted maze of narrow streets and towering structures that defied both gravity and building codes. Nyara's natural glow was hardly noticeable among the riot of neon signs and holographic advertisements that bathed everything in artificial twilight. Your contact, she said as James led her through the crowds, can we trust them? About as much as you can trust anyone down here, he replied, his hand never leaving hers. But Lieutenant Zhao owes me her life, and she hates Richardson almost as much as we do. They turned down an alley that seemed to breathe, its walls lined with bioluminescent fungi that reminded Nyara of home. James stopped at a door marked only with a faded red symbol. Whatever happens, he said, turning to face her, stay close. The Undercity isn't kind to outsiders, human or alien. The door opened to reveal a dimly lit gambling den. Various species hunched over tables of chance, their fates determined by cards, dice, and more exotic methods of testing luck. A tall woman with cybernetic eyes noticed their entrance and nodded toward a back room. Lieutenant, James greeted as they entered the private space. Not anymore, Zhao replied, her artificial eyes scanning them both. Though I see you're still collecting strays, Barrett. This is Nyara, James said, his tone carrying a warning. She's Dash. The Lycerian ambassador who just became the most wanted being in 3 sectors, Zhao finished. Your little light show at the diplomatic center caused quite a stir. She leaned back, studying them. The question is, why come to me? Because you still have access to the quantum relay network, James said. And because you know what Richardson really is. Zhao's cybernetic eyes whirred as they focused. He's a monster wearing a patriot's mask. The things I saw him do during the border conflicts. She shook her head. But this is bigger than just Richardson. The evidence you stole, it's already been classified as a state secret. Both states. We need to get the truth out, Nyara stepped forward, her skin pulsing with urgency. Before they can start their war. The truth? Zhao laughed bitterly. The truth is that there are powerful people on both sides who want this war. They've been planning it for years. Your discovery just forced them to accelerate their timeline. A distant explosion rocked the building, making the lights flicker. Zhao's artificial eyes swiveled toward the ceiling. They're sweeping the sector, she said grimly. You need to go. Now. The relay network, James pressed. Will you help us? Zhao reached into her desk and withdrew a small device. This will give you 15 minutes of direct access. After that, the encryption changes. She handed it to James. Don't waste it. Thank you, Nyara said, sensing the genuine concern beneath Zhao's harsh exterior. Don't thank me yet, Ambassador. The way out is going to be interesting. As if on cue, alarms began blaring throughout the district. James grabbed Nyara's hand again, and they ran. Behind them, they heard Zhao engaging security protocols. They emerged onto a maintenance walkway suspended between buildings. Far below, security forces were already cordoning off streets. Up, James decided, pulling her toward a maintenance ladder. They'll expect us to go down. They climbed as energy weapons fire began to fill the air around them. Nyara's natural agility made the ascent easier, but she could sense James struggling with his injured shoulder. Almost there, she encouraged, her free hand glowing with healing energy as she helped him up the final stretch. They reached the roof level just as a military transport appeared above them, its searchlights cutting through the perpetual smog. "Jump!" James shouted, pointing to an adjacent building. They leaped together, landing hard on the neighboring rooftop. But as they rolled to their feet, they found themselves surrounded by armed figures in stealth suits. "Enough running," a familiar voice called out. Admiral Richardson emerged from the shadows, looking immaculate despite the chaos. "Did you really think you could expose this? Do you have any idea what's at stake?" "The lives of millions," Nyara replied, her skin bright with defiance. "The peace we've spent years building." "Peace?" Richardson sneered. "Peace makes us weak. Conflict drives innovation, forces evolution. The war we're engineering will advance both our species by centuries." "You're insane," James said quietly, positioning himself slightly in front of Nyara. "I'm a visionary," Richardson corrected. "And you, James, are a disappointment. Just like your mother was." James tensed beside her, and Nyara felt a surge of protectiveness. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. "Last chance," Richardson offered. "Surrender now, and we can explain this all away. Resist, and you'll both be labeled terrorists. No one will ever know the truth." Nyara felt James squeeze her hand, and in that moment, she understood what he was planning. Her skin began to glow brighter, building to an intensity that made the humans around them shield their eyes. "Now!" James shouted, dropping Zhao's device. As it hit the ground, Nyara released a burst of pure biochemical energy, a defense mechanism her species rarely used. The blast temporarily overloaded both organic and cybernetic visual systems. In the chaos that followed, they fought as one. James's military training complemented Nyara's natural abilities perfectly. They moved in sync, covering each other's weaknesses, anticipating each other's needs. When it was over, Richardson and his men lay unconscious, and the device was broadcasting their evidence across the quantum relay network. The truth was out. "We did it," Nyara breathed, her glow pulsing with exhaustion and triumph. James pulled her close, his heart racing against her chest. "No," he said softly. "You did it. You trusted me, fought beside me, believed in me." He trailed off, his eyes searching hers. "Nyara, I dash." The kiss, when it came, felt like the most natural thing in the universe. Her bioluminescence created patterns of joy and desire that danced across their joined forms. In that moment, species didn't matter. Politics didn't matter. Only this connection, this understanding, this family they'd found in each other. But as emergency vehicles began converging on their location, they both knew their journey wasn't over. The conspiracy might be exposed, but its architects wouldn't go down without a fight. "Ready for what comes next?" James asked, still holding her close. Nyara's skin shimmered with determination and affection. "With you? Always."